This is the political spice theme review. The goal here, of course, is to review the major empires and states and civilizations from the course, but also to look at how they formed, how they exerted power over people, when they happened, and what their influence was on world history. So that's what we're looking at with these major topics here as we go through the course. This is the same slide for Unit 1 as in the other ones. So in the Paleolithic era, the hunter-gatherers were organized in some way, and usually that was by family or kinship groups, and this provided the source of authority. So in the earliest human civilizations, you obeyed somebody because you were related to them. You do need to know the first 6 civilizations shown on this map. This is chapter 3 in your book. You should, at minimum, know the location for this theme and also the dates of each of those civilizations. All of these civilizations contained cities and started to create institutions to help manage a larger group of people, such as bureaucracies and armies. They also expanded, and there's a variety of ways that they did this. Access to resources is one. The Hittites had access to iron, and that is mentioned in chapter 3. You might want to take a look at that. The Hittite Empire is shown here on the map, up here in this kind of greenish color, and they influenced the development of the Mesopotamian civilization. And also these civilizations produced more food, which helped the population grow. Some early examples of expansion or building empires. In Mesopotamia, we have the Sumerians, Akkadians, and Babylonians who progressively invaded that region. So those are 3 different empires located in an area called Mesopotamia, which is shown here, remember, between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. Remember that Hammurabi was a Babylonian ruler and that his Hammurabi's code helped to exert authority over people. And also Egypt and Nubia expanded along the Nile Valley. So now you're going to write a main idea statement for Unit 1. Again, Unit 2 is the era of classical empires. There's some more going on here and things start to get more complex. So here are the key states and empires from this unit. You should know, as listed here, the location, names, and time periods of them for starters. The Persian Empire was mentioned the least in your book. It is mentioned in chapter 4, so you might want to take another look at that. And then we spent more time on the ones that are listed on the rest of the slide here. Here is a map of the Persian Empire to give you some perspective. They did have some innovations. They created a postal system. There was a system of roads to help with communication. The religion of Zoroastrianism was a Persian religion, and that influenced the development of monotheistic religions. And remember, this is the territory that Alexander the Great conquered. Alexander the Great came from Macedonia over here, and there were a series of wars, and he eventually conquered much of the Persian Empire. Here we have the Qin and the Han dynasties. Look at the key for the map. So the Qin is the area around this red line, and then the Han dynasty is shown in purple here. And we'll talk in a bit about the Xiongnu, those nomads threatening the authority of the Han dynasty. Here's the Mauryan and Gupta empires in India, the Gupta being inside the green lines here, and then the Mauryan being orange. And check the dates here and make sure that you're clear that the Mauryan Empire happened first and then the Gupta. We did talk about Ashoka. He was a Mauryan emperor who converted to Buddhism, and these triangles here show statements that he put on pillars throughout the empire. So we have the Greek era of colonization. Remember, for Greece we have city-states, the Hellenistic and Roman empires. So the era of classical Greece, you learned a little bit about Athens and Sparta, kind of shown down here on this map. And remember, there is not one Greek empire during that time period. They're city-states often competing with each other. We have Alexander coming along and again conquering that era, and then he went to the right on this map. So we talk about the Hellenistic era. Under Alexander is when the Greek culture is unified, and that's in the 4th century BCE. And then much later, oh, by the way, that is shown here in the black outline on this map of Alexander's empire. Alexander's empire is split up into parts, shown by these colors after his death. And then we have the Roman Empire over here. That is the most extensive empire that succeeded Alexander's. Over in the Americas, we have Teotihuacan, which was a major trading city. And then we have the Mayan city-states as well. They're kind of similar to Greece. in that there isn't exactly a Mayan empire. It's really a collection of city-states that were linked by culture and trade. Then in the Andes region, you have Moche, and Chavin was a city inside that region. So the question next is, how did these empires administer or govern their territory? There's some institutions like having a centralized government, a system of laws, bureaucracy. The Chinese examination system is an example of that. The Romans emphasized legal systems. And then down here we have some information about how they exerted power over people. Diplomacy would be negotiating treaties, perhaps giving conquered people the right to maintain their religion, for instance. Supply lines help especially with the military. Fortifications, defensive walls and roads. The Great Wall of China would be certainly an example of a defensive wall. And in some cases, they conquered people and got new military officers from that population. Major cities you need to know about: Athens, which is relevant to those things, Rome, Constantinople, and Teotihuacan as helping to administer those empires. There were reasons these empires declined or even collapsed. Foreign invasion is one of those reasons. So we have the Xiongnu with northern China. We would also have the Germanic-speaking peoples with Rome. Now write a main idea statement for Unit 2. For Unit 3, this is our topic, 600 to 1450. We have empires sort of reconstituting following the collapse of them. So we have the Roman Empire shrinking a bit and turning into the Byzantine Empire. Following the Han dynasty, we have the Sui, Tang, and Song dynasties. And these empires combined traditional sources of power, meaning they continued what the previous empires had done, like having power concentrated in the hands of landowning elites. And in some cases, they had innovations, such as the tribute system developed by China in the Sui, Tang, and Song dynasties. New forms of governance. Remember, Islam is born in about the 7th century CE, so the Islamic caliphates, and then following those, the Delhi Sultanate in India, and the Muslim rule in Iberia, which is the Spanish and Portuguese peninsula, are therefore new forms of governance because they are Islamic states. We have the Mongol Khanates. After the Great Khanate under Chinggis Khan, we have that empire split into those three areas. And then we have city-states. On the Italian peninsula, the city-state of Venice is very important in Mediterranean trade. You learned about the Swahili city-states in East Africa, which were connected to Indian Ocean trade, as was the city-state of Malacca, which controlled an important trading area. In some cases, states expanded. They used kind of borrowed local traditions. So after the Umayyad Caliphate collapsed, the Abbasid Caliphate moved the capital to Baghdad and was more influenced by Persian culture. And also Shotoku Taishi was a Japanese administrator who encouraged learning the techniques of Chinese rule, like the examination system. In the Americas, systems expanded as well. I just talked about the Maya city-states a little while ago. And remember, the Aztecs and Incas are going to come along. Note here it says at the end of this period, pay attention to the dates here. You should know the dates for the Mayas and the Aztecs, for instance. They're in the similar part of the world in Mesoamerica, or what is present-day Mexico, but not at the same time. So definitely review those dates. Now write a main idea statement for Unit 3. Excuse me. For Unit 4, we're moving into 1450 to 1750. We have the formation of new elites. So remember the Qing dynasty is foreign conquest. The Manchus were a different ethnic group, and when they did that, they became the political elites. And then remember, when the Spanish invade, they create a new social hierarchy, and the new elites there are the Creoles. These are the children of European parents born in the Americas, and they are the elite ruling class in the Spanish-American colonies. This is about the power of existing elites maybe going up and down. So this is kind of about feudalism in both Europe and Japan. It depends on how powerful the monarch is. As the monarchies become more severe in their control in Europe, the power of the nobility goes down. And remember, under the Tokugawa shogunate, the power was concentrated in the hands of a shogun, and the daimyo are the local lords in Japan, and so their power goes down because the shogun is more powerful. This is how rulers consolidated their power in this era. One of the reasons you studied Shakespeare this year was to see that that helps to display political power. The king or queen was the patron of the arts and sponsored those plays, and many of them reminded people of the power of the monarch. In the Chinese examination system, they were recruiting bureaucratic elites. And in the Ottoman Empire, they used devshirme. Remember, that is the recruitment of military professionals from families. So these all help them to control people. In addition to those methods, we have kind of more forceful methods of creating empires. So the trading post empires for Europeans were created by force. There are 4 examples of land empires that expanded dramatically. The Manchu Qing dynasty is kind of an expansion here shown. It expands from the dark to the light purple over these dates. The Mughal Empire, remember the Turks invaded from the north, and it expands slowly during this era all the way down to here. We have the Ottoman Empire, which began with the light purple shown here on this map and is going to expand all the way to the orange. And then we have the Russian Empire, which begins just on this little purple part here, and over the period of about 300 years or so expands to include everything that's colored on this map. In Europe, we have the creation of maritime empires. These are the European colonies in the Americas, and this key shown here will help you get straight which is which. So there were some challenges to this process. Piracy in the Caribbean was a threat to the Europeans' trade routes. Typically, remember, those pirates are Europeans attacking the ships from their rivals. So there might be French pirates attacking British ships or the other way around. We also have rivalries in Europe. We have the 30 Years' War. And in the Islamic world, we have the conflict between the Ottoman and Safavid empires. And in some cases, there was local resistance. One of the causes of the French Revolution was peasant revolts over the rising price of bread. Now write a main idea statement for Unit 4. For Unit 5, we have industrialization and expanding power, especially of European states. So remember, in the economic theme, you would be looking more specifically at global capitalism. This is the driving economic force behind industrialization, in which people are motivated by profit. And that creates what seems to the lower classes to be an exploitation. And so there is some resistance to that. And so governments responded to that criticism of saying, the system is unfair, and often to the threat of rebellion by attempting some types of reforms. So suffrage, remember, means voting. So in Britain, the Reform Act of 1832 extended the right to vote to all men, and that was designed to help prevent a rebellion, similar maybe to what was going to happen, for instance, in Russia with the Communist Revolution much later. Okay, so industrializing powers created these empires. In some cases, the British in India and the Dutch in Indonesia, these presences are intensified and expanded. In addition to Europe, the Americans and Japanese created empires during this time period, and the Spanish and Portuguese influence is declining. In some cases, war was used, such as Belgium and the Congo. And there were settler colonies like the British in Australia, which were not necessarily taken over by force so much as a slow process of more and more residents of a particular country, in this case Britain, settling in a particular place and expanding their presence. So imperialism. Remember that there is a type of imperialism with American influence over Japan. That's going to lead to the fall of the Tokugawa shogunate and the Meiji reforms. We have the American, Russian, and Qing empires expanding their borders. From a world history standpoint, westward expansion in U.S. history, the westward movement, is an example of this imperial expansion. We have, in some cases, the contraction of empires. So in the Ottoman Empire, the Balkan states, like Greece, for instance, got their independence in the 19th century. And that is often motivated by nationalism. That's certainly true with Greek independence from the Ottoman Empire. And it's also true with the nation of Germany in the late 19th century kind of joining together because of shared cultural and political identities. We have the Enlightenment during this time period. Thinkers like John Locke, who talked about natural rights, challenged the idea that monarchies were chosen by God and said that essentially governments should serve the people instead of the other way around. And that, of course, is going to have a big influence on revolutions. So revolutionary movements. we have the American colonial revolutions in Haiti, the United States, and Latin America. In France, subjects rebelled against their monarchy. The Wahhabi rebellion was a cultural movement to return to the basics of Islam, and that challenged the authority of the Ottoman Empire. And there's some writings that you could look at that we looked at a little bit as examples of Enlightenment influence. The American Declaration of Independence, the French Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, and the Jamaica Letter was written by Simón Bolivar to explain, essentially, and justify the Spanish-American revolutions. There are more rebellions during this time period. Anti-colonial movements. So in India, this is a revolt against the influence of the British. Remember that the Indian Revolt of 1857 is going to lead to the British government deciding to directly administer India instead of having the British East India Company do it. The Boxer Rebellion is an anti-foreign rebellion in China. In some cases, they were influenced by religion. In China, the Taiping Rebellion, remember, was a essentially Christian rebellion that resulted in the deaths of 20 million people. And in some cases, imperial governments made some reforms in response to them. So in Ottoman Empire, the Tanzimat movement and the self-strengthening movement in China were both ways to address these concerns and deal with, in those cases, increasing European influence. So you should definitely review those. There was migration during this time period. Industrialization creates different economic forces and job opportunities. So people are migrating around the world to look for jobs. People immigrating to the Americas, an example of that, the United States, which industrialized. And in some cases, those societies did not always embrace people. And an example we talked about was the Chinese Exclusion Act. There were a lot of Chinese immigrants working in the west coast of the United States during the time of the gold rush. And there was a law in the United States that refused entry of Chinese immigrants for a certain time period. So now write a main idea statement for Unit 5. Our last unit, globalization. So as empires fall, there's a new form of political organization. So we have these big land-based empires collapsing. It's really World War I, World War II that is the final call for these guys. So by the 1920s, the Ottoman, Russian, and Qing empires are all gone. In some cases, colonies negotiated their independence. Remember Gandhi's efforts. And India got their independence from Britain without a war. And in some cases, there was a war. Algeria got its independence from France. This is in North Africa through a war, and that's in the 1960s. So again, a little bit more about nationalism. So Gandhi kind of talked about India as a nation to challenge the rule of the British. In some cases, there was religious elements to this. Muhammad Ali Jinnah, remember, formed the Muslim League, and that eventually is going to create the nation of Pakistan. And in some cases, there were movements to unite people across national boundaries. Pan-Africanism was a movement to encourage people of Africa to join together. From a synthesis standpoint, this would be similar to what Simón Bolivar attempted to do with the Spanish-American colonies back in the early 1800s. Now we're kind of in the mid-1900s, and that is going to have limited success, but definitely helps to create a sense of African identity that fuels independence efforts in the African colonies of Europe. So, unprecedented military conflict. World War I and World War II were total wars in the sense that they consumed a huge portion of a nation's resources and affected civilians to a greater extent than earlier wars. And the next one talks a little bit about how governments encourage people to support them. This is kind of a propaganda thing. Why did these conflicts happen? The imperialist expansion by Europe and Japan is going to cause them to compete with each other, creating conflict. That involves a competition for resources to fuel the growing industrial economies. We have the ethnic conflict in Europe before World War I and also World War II. We have the Germanic ethnic group, that would be primarily Germany and Austria, having conflict with the Slavic ethnic group led by Russia, but Russia is certainly supporting nations like Serbia that are threatened by the Germanic people. And then we have a conflict between Japan and China in Asia. There's also rivalries. In the late 19th century and early 20th, there's a big rivalry between Great Britain and Germany. And of course, nationalism in all areas causes people to support their country's war efforts. And the technology created huge casualties. So obviously in the 20th century, we have new military technology. that is going to cause a huge number of deaths. Maybe 15 million people died in World War I, and maybe 50 in World War II. At the end of World War II, we have the global balance of power shifting. So those European powers are declining, and we have two superpowers at the end of World War II, the US and the Soviet Union. And the Cold War, of course, sees an ideological struggle between essentially democratic capitalism and totalitarian communism. So capitalism and communism are really economic theories, and they have political ideologies that go along with them. Each side forms alliances, NATO and the Warsaw Pact, and that lasts for about 40, 50 years, and it's the collapse of communism in the Soviet Union in around 1990 that ends the Cold War. There were various responses to this conflict. Gandhi, of course, promotes nonviolence. In some cases, countries built up their militaries in huge form. So after World War II, we have the US creating what was referred to as a military-industrial complex, meaning that a huge portion of the government's resources were still put towards the military. And in some cases, terrorism have been used to achieve political aims as well, as in the case of Al-Qaeda at the end of the 20th century. Increasing interdependence between states. So the League of Nations, which is after World War I and has limited success, and the United Nations after World War II, which has a little bit more success, are creating an interdependent political relationship. And in some cases, independent organizations that are more humanitarian, like Doctors Without Borders, are trying to solve humanitarian crises if political states or the UN are unwilling or unable to do so. Now write a main idea for Unit 6. And that's the end of your political review. Happy studying.